This is Colin, ModernVivo's CTO. We're really excited to have you try out the V2 beta of our application. You'll notice some changes in the V2 beta, and I'll walk you through them now. First off, at any time when you're in the beta application, you can return to the V1 of our system, the version that you're more familiar with, in a couple of different ways. First, you're always able to return to the V1 by clicking Return to V1 on the navigation sidebar. Next, when you go to your search history, you'll notice that searches that you've already submitted on the application prior to the launch of V2 of the V2 beta have been marked as legacy. Attempting to open any of these searches will prompt you to either rerun the search in V2, reopening the search builder, or to view the results and return to V1. This is because we've made some changes to how search results are displayed. Let's jump into the search builder and click Rerun Search. Clicking Rerun Search from a V1 legacy search will open up the search builder and pre-fill in the search query keywords that you used when building the original search. Otherwise, this first step of the search builder is exactly the same as V1. Next, you'll see that we've renamed conditions to extractions. This is more of a terminological change, but you will see differences in the selectable options down below. We now always extract certain core information, certain core extracted fields from papers, including things like some genetic information, things that we call experimental factors, which are things about the animals or experimental groups within a study, certain information about interventions. We always extract animal species and the like. However, you're still able to select a large number of different new extraction fields from papers that we process for you. As you scroll through this list, you'll see that the cards display both the card name, in this case this refers to what we call as the extraction module, and each extraction module will have one or more extraction fields. Most of these extraction modules only have one field. For example, the animal age extraction module only has the extraction field age. However, if we scroll down, you'll see that the administration timing extraction module has two extraction fields. The actual timing, so for example, 3 hours, and what that timing is relative to, where relative to may be something like administration, first administration of an intervention, etc. You can see some of these as well, like protein or gene targets, have multiple extraction fields as well. And you can select these much like you were able to select conditions. Finally, the confirmation step is largely unchanged. You won't see this provenance extraction. This is just an internal tool. Otherwise, all the other options on this page are exactly the same, and you can submit searches exactly as you were able to in V1. I'll go ahead and terminate the search that we just started. Now, let's look at search results for a new search on the V2 beta. We've changed the card design of papers that we extract in the search results page just a bit. The biggest change is that you'll now see tabs for the individual studies that we identify in a particular paper. We've shifted away from in vivo models being the main way that we segment information that gets extracted in papers that we process for you to this new studies system. In this case, this first paper only has a single study, a 5xFAD transgenic mouse Alzheimer's study. But as we scroll down, we may see other papers that have multiple studies. Here's one. And you can select between the tabs and you'll see the different extraction and extracted information. In addition, for each study, we now extract different extraction fields and modules and information depending on the experimental groups that were studied in a particular study. In this case, we have an experimental group for wild type and we have an experimental group for the APP-PS1 mice. And clicking between them, you can see that the wild type has just animal age information extracted as well as the animal's genetic background. Whereas if we look into the APP-PS1 mice experimental group, we now see a genetic factor on the animal explaining in more detail the alleles name and genotype of the mice in that experimental group, as well as the identified disease for that experimental group. Anytime that we extract a disease, as we call a disease factor in the application, we also extract the induction method, here listed as a sub-card of the disease factor card. In this case, signaling that the genetic factor that was extracted for these mice was the induction method for that disease. In this case, the APP-PS1 alleles genotype of the mice was the induction method for the Alzheimer's disease, the identified Alzheimer's disease for these mice. We also now extract by default the assays and output measures for experimental groups within studies, and these also change. Oftentimes the assays and output measures are the same for experimental groups, but you will see as you click through that some do change. You're still able to see methods and results summaries for papers, as well as author affiliation information by clicking into the paper details button for a particular paper. Opening up this displays, again, the same extracted information cards as you can see on the main page. But if you scroll down, you can see the method summary, the result summary, and the author affiliation information down below. If you haven't used them yet on the main application, we've also introduced a new Drugs tab, Clinical Trials tab, and Regulatory Documents tab. The Drugs tab lists all of the identified interventional drugs that were identified in studies in the search. And in each of these cards, you can click to view the papers, you can view the clinical trials for that drug that we've identified, as well as the regulatory documents relating to that drug. So for example, if we click into the clinical trials tab, here we list all of the clinical trials that have been identified for the drugs that have been identified in your search. In this case, there are many clinical trials for apomorphine, and for every clinical trial, we display the actual drug, the title of the clinical trial, the indications for that clinical trial as reported by the trial itself, its clinical phase, its clinical trial ID, as well as a link back to the original clinical trial. And on each of these tabs, we do provide you the filters sidebar, and you can select among any filters here, and it will filter down the list. In this case, for clinical trials, it will filter down the list of clinical trials only to the drugs that have been identified in papers that match the filters that you select. On the regulatory documents tab, we list the regulatory documents that we've identified for all of those same drugs. In this case, there are quite a few number of regulatory documents that we've identified for apomorphine, and you can see the document types here. There's the chemistry review, clinical pharmacology, another clinical review, other reviews, non-clinical reviews. We provide you both a link to the original document, as well as a summary of the document that you can click through and read. On the papers tab as well, we've now introduced another filter option for you to see and view what we call unavailable and excluded papers. Typically, these are papers that are unavailable, perhaps paywalled, or papers that were excluded because they were either review articles or they ostensibly did not talk about in vivo research. You can click into this filter option, and these papers will be added to your search results. So as we scroll down, we can see that there are now several unavailable papers here that we were not able to extract information from and process. However, we do provide you links back to the original papers for those papers still identified. So if you run a search and you're expecting to find certain papers that weren't found, you can click into the unavailable and excluded papers filter option, click unavailable or click excluded in review / non in vivo papers, and most likely the paper that you expect to find will be listed there and either marked again as excluded because it was a review article or, again, did not talk about in vivo research, or it was just unavailable for our system to process. Finally, we have the decision tree. The decision tree is a new feature to allow you to explore the information that we've extracted from the papers processed in your search in a hierarchical manner. The first thing that you select in the decision tree is the disease of interest. This was an APPPS1 Y-maze search, so let's look at the papers and information for Alzheimer's disease. We'll select Alzheimer's disease. Next, you'll select an animal species. In this case, mice were the only species extracted in this search. After selecting the animal species, you'll then select the specific induction method that you're interested in that was used to induce the selected disease. In this case, we're looking at the induction methods for Alzheimer's disease. Again, since this was an APPPS1 search, the vast majority of papers are going to highlight the genetic factor for APPPS1 as the induction method for Alzheimer's disease. So here we'll select genetic factor, and then the subtype of the genetic factor, we have several options for APPPS1 as well as 5XFADs and several others. We'll select the first main APPPS1 transgene induction method. After selecting an induction factor, you can now explore the various assays that were conducted in the studies using all of the extraction fields that you have selected so far. So in this case, this list shows us all of the assays that were conducted in studies looking at Alzheimer's disease in mice that were induced with an APPPS1 transgene genetic factor. Then you can select an assay and view the output measures that were recorded in that assay of all studies, again, matching the criteria that you have selected thus far. At any time on the decision tree, you have several available actions. You can view the papers that match all of the filters that you have selected thus far. You can view the drugs or the clinical trials or the regulatory documents that also match those same filters. So we can go back to the main search results page here by clicking View Papers. You'll get a dialog box here that's asking for your confirmation to go to the page, because doing this will reset any currently selected filters you have on the search results page. So if you have any selected filters and you want to in some way preserve that information, you can export the selected search results with those filters applied, or otherwise record and note down the information that you were looking for with those filters applied before overwriting them with the filters as applied by the decision tree.